The 7-month siege ended at last, but it was not until the brightness of May was on the fields outside, and the deadly blight of famine on all within, that a haggard, wasted-looking deputation came down from the upper city to treat with the king. Henry was never severe with the inhabitants of French cities, and exacted no harsh terms, save that he insisted that Voris, the robber captain, and his 2 chief lieutenants, should be given up to him to suffer condign punishment. The warriors who had shut themselves up to hold out the place by honorable warfare for the Dauphin must be put to ransom as prisoners of war, but the burghers were to be unmolested, on condition of their swearing allegiance to Henry as regent for, and heir of, Charles VI. To this the deputies consented, and the next day was fixed for the surrender. The difficulty was, as Henry had found at Harfleur, Rouen, and many other places, to enforce forbearance on his soldiery, who regarded plunder as their lawful prey, the enemy as their natural game, and the trouble a city had given them as a cause for unmercifulness. The more time changed his army from the feudal gathering of English country gentlemen and yeomen to mercenary bands of men-at-arms, the mere greedy, rapacious, and insubordinate became their temper. Well knowing the greatness of the peril, and that the very best of his captains had scarcely the will, if they had the power, to restrain the license that soon became barbarity unimaginable, he spoke sadly overnight of his dread of the day of surrender, when it might prove impossible to prevent deeds that would be not merely a blot on his scutcheon, but a shame to human nature, looking back to the exultation with which he had entered Harfleur as a mere effect of boyish ignorance and thoughtlessness. Having taken all possible precautions, he stood in his full armor, with the fox's brush in his helmet, under the great elm in the marketplace, received the keys, accepted the sword of the captain commissioned by Charles with royal courtesy, gave his hand to be kissed by the mayor, and then, with grave inexorable air, like a statue of steel, watched as the freebooter Voris and his 2 chief companions were led down with their hands tied, halters round their necks, and priests at their sides, preparing them to be hung on that very tree. They were proud hard men, and uttered no entreaty for grace. They had hung too many travelers upon these same branches not to expect their own turn, and they were no cravens to abase themselves. That act of justice ended, Henry mounted his war-horse and rode in at the gates. His will was to go straight to the principal church, and there attend a solemn mass of thanksgiving, but experience had taught him that his devotions were the very opportunity of his men's rapine. He had therefore arranged that as soon as he should have arrived in the choir of the cathedral, James should take his place, and he slip out by a side door, so as to return to the scene of action. In full procession he and his suite reached the chief door, and there dismounted in an immense crowd, which thronged in at the doors. "Come, Glenisky," said Ralph Percy, as the 2 youths were pushed close together in the press, "if you have a fancy for being smothered in the minster, I have none. We shall never be missed. 'Twill be sport to walk round and see how these hardy rogues contrive to hold out." Malcolm willingly turned aside with him, and looked down the sloping street, which was swarming with comers and goers. The whole place was in an inflammable state. Soldiers were demanding quarters, which the citizens unwillingly gave. A refusal or expostulation against a rough entry led to violence, and ever as the 2 youths walked farther from the cathedral, there was more of excitement, more rude oaths of soldiers, more shrieking of women, often crying out even before any harm was done to them or their houses. At last, before a tall overhanging house, there was an immense press, and a frightful din of shouts and imprecations, filling both the newcomers with infectious eagerness. "How now? How now?" called Percy. "Keep the peace, good fellows." "Sir," cried a number of voices, passionately, "the French villains have barred their door. There's a lot of cowardly Armagnacs hid there with their gold, trying to balk honest men of their ransom." Such was the cry resounding on all sides. "Have at them! There's the rogue at the windows! Out on the fellows! Burn down the door! 'Tis Voris himself and all his gold! Treason! Treason!" The clamor was convincing to the spirit, if not to the senses. The two lads believed in the concealed Armagnacs, or perhaps more truly were carried away by the vehemence around them, and with something of the spirit of the chase, threw themselves headlong into the affair. "Open! Open!" shouted Ralph. "Open, in the name of King Henry!" An old man's face peeped through a little wicket in the door, and at sight of the two youths, evidently of high rank, said in a trembling voice, "Alas! Alas! Sir, bid these cruel men go away. I have nothing here, no one, only my sick daughter." "You hear," said Malcolm, turning round, "only his sick daughter." "Sick daughter, old liar! Here's an honest tinker makes oath he has hoards of gold laid up for Voris, and 10 Armagnacs hidden in his house. Have at him! Bring fire!" Blows hailed thick on the door, a flaming torch was handed over the heads of the throng, horrible growls and roars pervaded them. Malcolm and Ralph, furious at the cheat, stood among the foremost, making so much noise themselves between thundering and reviling, and calling out, "Where are the Armagnacs?" Down with the traitors, that they were not aware of a sudden hush behind them, till a buffet from a heavy hand fell on Malcolm's shoulder, and a mighty voice cried, "Shame! Shame! What, you too?" "There are traitors hid here, sir," said Percy, in angry self-justification. "And what an if there are? Back, every one of you. Rogues that you be, here, Fitzhugh, see those villains back to the camp. Let their arms be given up to the provost-marshal. Kites and crows as you are. Away, out with you." Henry pointed to the broken door, and the cowed and abashed soldiers slunk away from the terrible light of his eyes. No man could stand before the face of the king. There was a stillness. He stood leaning on his sword, his chest heaving with his panting breaths. He was naturally as fleet as the swift-footed Achilles, but the winter had told upon him, and the haste with which he had rushed to the rescue left him breathless and speechless, while he seemed as it were to nail the two lads to the spot by his steady gaze of mingled distress and displeasure. Neither could brook his eye. Percy hung his head like a boy in a scrape. Malcolm quailed with terror, but at the same time felt a keen sense of injury in being thus treated as a plunderer, and the blow under which his shoulder ached seemed an indignity to his royal blood. "Boys," said Henry, still low and breathlessly, but all the more impressively, "what is to become of honor and mercy if such as you must needs become ravening wolves at scent of booty?" "It was not booty, sir, they said traitors were hid here," said Percy, sulkily. "Tush! The old story. Ever the plea for rapine and bloodthirstiness. After the warnings of last night you should have known better, but you were all alike in frenzy for a sack. You have both put off your knighthood till you have learnt not to become ashamed thereto." "I take not knighthood at your hands, sir," burst out Malcolm, goaded with hot resentment, but startled the next moment at the sound of his own words. "I cry you mercy," said King Henry, in a cold, short tone. Malcolm turned on his heel and walked away, without waiting to see how the poor old man in the house threw himself at the king's feet with a piteous history of his sick daughter and her starving children, nor how Ralph hurried off headlong to the lower town to send them immediate relief in bread, wine, and doctors. The gay, good-natured, thoughtless lad no more harbored malice for the chastisement than if his tutor had caught him idling, but things went deeper with Malcolm. True, he had undergone many a brutal jest and cruel practical joke from his cousins, but that was all in the family, not like a blow from an alien king, and one not apologized for, but followed up by a rebuke that seemed to him unjust, lowering him in his own eyes and those of Esclairmont, and making him ready to gnaw himself with moody vexation. "You hear, Malcolm," said King James, entering his quarters, "did you miss me in the throng? I have not seen you all day." "I have been insulted, sir," said Malcolm. "I pray your license to depart and carry my sword to my kinsman in the French camp." "How now? Is it the way to treat an insult to run away from it?" Not when the world judges men to be on equal terms, my lord. What? Who has done you wrong, you silly loon? King Henry, sir, he struck me with his fist, and rated me like his hound, and I will not eat another morsel of his bread unless he would answer it to me in single combat. Little enough bread you'd eat after that same answer, ejaculated James. Oh! I understand now. You were with young Hotspur and the rest that set on the poor townsman, and Harry made small distinction of persons. Nay, Malcolm, it was ill in you, that talked of so loathing Spolsey. I wanted no Spolsey. There were Armagnacs hid in the house, and the king would not hear us. He knew that story too well. Were you asleep or idling last night, when he warned all, on no plea whatever, to break into a house, but, if the old tale of treachery came up, to set a guard, and call one of the captains? Did you hear him, eh? I can take chiding from you, sir, but neither words nor blows from any other king in Christendom, still less when he threatens me that I have deferred my knighthood. As if I would have it from him. From me you will not have it until he have pardoned Ralph Percy, said James, dryly. Malcolm, I had not thought you such a fool body. Under a captain's banner, what can be done but submit to his rule? I should do so myself, were Salisbury or March in command. Then, sir, said Malcolm, much hurt that the king did not take his part, I shall carry my service elsewhere. So, said James, much vexed, this is the meek lad that wanted to hide in a convent from an ill world, flying off from his king and kinsman that he may break down honest men's doors at his will. That I may be free from insult, sir. You think John of Buchan liked to cosset you. You found the Black Douglas so courtly to me the other day as to expect him to be tender to this nicety of yours. Malcolm, as your prince and guardian, I forbid this folly, and command you to lay aside this fit of malice and do your devoir. What? Sobbing, silly lad, where's your manhood? Sir, what will they think of me, the Lady Esclairmont and all, if they hear I have sat down tamely with a blow? She will never think about you at all but as a sullen malapert near Duweel, if you go off to that camp of routiers, trying to prop a bad cause because you cannot take correction, nor observe discipline. A sudden suspicion came over Malcolm that the king would not thus make light of the offense, if it had really been the inexpiable insult he had supposed it, and the thought was an absolute relief, for in effect the parting from James, and joining the party opposed to Esclairmont's friends, would have been so tremendous a step, that he could hardly have contemplated it in his sober senses, and he murmured, "My honor, sir," in a tone that James understood. "Oh, for your honor, you need not fear for that. Any knight in the army could have done as much without prejudice to your honor. Why, you silly loon, do you think I would not have been as angered as yourself, if your honor had been injured?" Malcolm's heart felt easier, but he still growled. "Then, sir, if you assure me that I can do so without detriment to my honor, I will not quit you." James laughed. "It might have been more graciously spoken, my good cousin, but I am beholden to you." Malcolm, ashamed and vexed at the sarcastic tone, held his tongue for a little while, but presently exclaimed, "Will the Bishop of Therouenne hear of it?" James laughed. "Belike not, or, if he should, it would only seem to him the reasonable training of a young squire." The king did not say what crossed his own mind, that the Bishop of Therouenne was more likely to think Henry over-strict in discipline, and absurdly rigorous. The prelate, Charles de Luxembourg, brother to the Count de St. Pol, had made several visits to the English camp. He was one of these princely younger sons, who, like Beaufort at home, took ecclesiastical preferments as their natural provision, and as a footing whence they might become statesmen. He was a great admirer of Henry's genius, and, as the chief French prelate who was heartily on the English side, enjoyed a much greater prominence than he could have done at either the French or Burgundian court.
He and his brother of St. Pol were Esclairmon's nearest kinsman uncles à la mode de Bretagne, as they call the relationship which is here sometimes termed Welsh uncle, or first cousins once removed, and from him James had obtained much more complete information about Esclairmon than he could ever get from the flighty Duchess.
Her mother, a beautiful Walloon, had been heiress to wide domains in Hainaut, her father to great estates in Flanders, all which were at present managed by the politic bishop. Like most of the statesman's secular clergy, the bishop hated nothing so much as the monastic orders, and had made no small haste to remove his fair niece from the convent at Dijon, where she had been educated, lest the Cistercians should become possessed of her lands. He had one scheme for her marriage, but his brother, the count, had wished to give her to his own second son, who was almost an infant, and the Duke of Burgundy had designs on her for his half-brother Beaumont, and among these various disputants, Esclairmont had never failed to find support against whichever proposal was forced upon her, until the coalition between the Dukes of Burgundy and Brabant becoming too strong, she had availed herself of Countess Jacqueline's discontent to evade them. Both. The family had, of course, been much angered, and had fully expected that her estates would go to some great English abbey, or to some English lord whose haughty reserve and insularity would be insupportable. It was therefore a relief to Monseigneur de Thérouenne to hear James's designs, and when the king further added that he would be willing to let the claims on the Hainaut part of her estates be purchased by the Count de St. Pol, and those in Flanders by the Duke of Burgundy, the bishop was delighted, and declared that, rather than such a negotiation should fail, he would himself advance the sum to his brother, but that the Duke of Burgundy's consent was more doubtful, only could they not do without it? And he honored Malcolm with a few words of passing notice from time to time, as if he almost regarded him as a relation. No doubt it would have been absurd to fly from such chances as these to Patrick Drummond in the opposite camp, and yet there were times when Malcolm felt as if he should get rid of a load on his heart if he were to break with all his present life, hurry to Patrick, confess the whole to him, and then hide his head in some hermitage, leaving his pledge unforfeited. That, however, could not be. He was bound to the king, and might not desert him, and it was not unpleasant to brood over the sacrifice of his own displeasure. "See," said Henry, in the evening, as he came into the refectory and walked up to James, "I have found my signet. It was left in the finger of my Spanish glove, which I had not worn since the beginning of winter. Thanks to all who took vain pains to look for it." But Malcolm did not respond with his pleased look to the thanks. He was not in charity with Henry, and crept out of hearing of him, while James was saying, "You had best destroy one or the other, or they will make mischief. Here, I'll crush it with the pommel of my sword." "I," said Henry, laughing, "you'd like to shew off one of your sledgehammer blows, Sir Bras de Fer. But, Master Scott, you shall not smash the English shield so easily. This one hangs too loose to be safe. I shall keep it to serve me when we have fattened up at Paris, after the leanness of our siege." "Hal," said James, seeing his gay temper restored, "you have grievously hurt that springald of mine. His northern blood cannot away with the taste he got of your fist." "Pretty well for your godly young monk, to expect to rob unchecked," laughed Henry. "He will do well at last," said James. "Manhood has come on him with a rush, and borne him off his feet, nor would I have him overtame." "There spake the Scot," said Henry. "By my faith, Jamie, we should have had you the worst robber of all had we not caught you young. Well, what am I due for this sprig of royalty? Say I struck unawares? Nay, had I known him, I'd have struck with as much of a will as his slight bones would bear." "And you love me, Hal, do something to cool his ill blood, and remove the sense of shame that sinks a lad in his own eyes." "Methought," said Henry, "there was more shame in the deed than in the buffet." Nevertheless the good-natured king took an occasion of saying, "My lord of Glenisky, I smote without knowing you. It was no place for a prince, nay, for any honest man, otherwise no hand should have been laid on my guest or my brother's near kinsman. And whereas I hear that both you and my fiery hot Percy verily credited the cry that prisoners were hid in that house, let me warn you that never was place yielded on composition but some villain got up the shout, and hundreds of fools followed it, till they learnt villainy in their turn. Therefore I ever chastise transgression of my command to touch neither dwelling nor inhabitant. You have both learnt your lesson, and the lion rampant and he of the straight tail will both be reined up better another time. Malcolm had no choice but to bend his head, mutter something, and let the king grasp his hand, though to him the apology seemed none at all, but rather to increase the offence, since the blame was by no means taken back again, while the condescension was such as could not be rejected, and thus speciously took away his excuse for brooding over his wrath. His hand lay so unwillingly in that strong hearty clasp that the king dropped it, frowned, shrugged his shoulders, and muttered to himself, "Sullen young dog. No Scot can let bygones be bygones," and then he turned away and cast the trifle from his memory. James was amazed not to see the moody face clear up, and asked of Malcolm whether he were not gratified with this ample satisfaction. "I trow I must be, sir," said Malcolm. "I tell thee, boy," said James, "not one king, nay, not one man in 1,000 would have offered thee the frank amends King Harry hath done this day. Nay, I doubt whether even he could so have done, were it not that the hope of his wife's coming hath made him overflow with joy and charity to all the world." Malcolm did not make much reply, and James regarded him with some disappointment. The youth was certainly warmly attached to him, but these tokens of superiority to the faults of his time and country which had caused the king to seek him for a companion seemed to have vanished with his feebleness and timidity. The manhood that had been awakened was not the chivalrous, generous, and gentle strength of Henry and his brothers, but the punctilious pride and sullenness, and almost something of the license, of the Scot. The camp had not proved the school of chivalry that James, in his inexperience, had imagined it must be under Henry, and the tedium and wretchedness of the siege had greatly added to its necessary evils by promoting a reckless temper and willingness to snatch at any enjoyment without heed to consequences. Close attendance on the king's had indeed prevented either Malcolm or Percy from even having the temptation of running into any such lengths as those gentry who had plundered the shrine of St. Fiacre at Bruhl, or were continually galloping off for an interval of dissipation at Paris, but they were both on the outlook for any snatch of stolen diversion, for in ceasing from monastic habits Malcolm seemed to have laid aside the scruples of a religious or conscientious youth, and specially avoided Dr. Bennet, the king's almoner. James feared he had been mistaken, and looked to the influence of Esclairmonde to repair the evil, if perchance she should follow the Queen de France. And this it was almost certain she must do, since she was entirely dependent upon the Countess of Hainaut, and could not obtain admission to a nunnery without recovering a portion of her estates.